Good afternoon. Welcome to panel 3, which is how do we target safety net programs to promote intergenerational economic mobility? This is certainly an important topic simply because economic mobility has declined over the last 50 years here in the United States. There may be some movement in kind of the middle income, middle part of the income and distribution, but at that lower quintile, the bottom, people seem to be stuck there. They may earn more than their parents, but they never really move out of that bottom quintile. Same could be said kind of for that top quartile, or quintile, I'm sorry. That many people, not all, but many people stay in that top quintile. They don't really move downwards. So this is an important topic about how can we help the safety net, how can the safety net help families move, have a bit more mobility. So we're gonna have 3 speakers today provide some insight on that. We'll begin with Marianne Page, who is a professor of economics and director of the Center for Poverty Research at the University of California, Davis. Her research focuses on intergenerational mobility, the U.S. safety net, education, gender, and equality of opportunity in the United States. We have Marianne Butler, who is a professor of economics at the University of California, Davis, a research associate with the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a research fellow at the Institute of Labor Economics. Her research focuses on the effects of government safety net programs on disadvantaged groups, economic demography, health economics, public economics, and the economics of education. And we will conclude with Elizabeth Cascio, is a professor at economics at Dartmouth University. She specializes in the study of education and of social policy pertaining to young children, often in historical perspective. Her recent and ongoing research endeavors to understand how educational and social progress is enabled and held back by matters of policy design, economic conditions, and political voice. Turn it over to Marianne.
Okay. Just checking my. So I'm very happy to be here today to talk about the role of the safety net in promoting intergenerational economic mobility. And by agreement, as the first speaker on this panel, I'm going to start with a brief introduction to the topic, and then I'm going to talk about health and nutrition programs and what we're learning about the extent to which early life access to these programs helps children ultimately achieve economic success. So let me start with a couple of facts because I'm not sure where everyone in the room is coming from. I think it's fair to say that by any measure, child poverty in the United States is very high. Child poverty, as of the last count, was at about the poverty rate was about 19.7%, which compares to a rate of 12.4% for working-aged adults, and is more than 3 or 2 times the poverty rate among the elderly. So compared to other age groups, child poverty is very high. 1 in 10 children in the United States spends half of their childhood in poverty. And by almost any metric, child poverty is higher in the United States than in most developed countries. So this is one example of a set of statistics, I hope it's not too blurry, put together by the United Nations Children's Fund. And I think you can see, is this working? It's hard for me to see from where I am. But if you look at the very bottom of the blue section, you can see that the United States rates almost at the very bottom, just above Romania. And you might quibble about the use of this particular metric, but these types of statistics put together in many different ways, and the United States rates almost always at the bottom. Most important for the topic in this panel, however, is that individuals who grow up in poverty are much more likely to grow up to be poor adults than children or individuals who do not grow up in poverty. So what you see over here on the, for you, very far left side is the probability of growing up to be poor in young or middle adulthood if you have grown up in a non-poor family. So depending on the age we're looking at, it's between about 1% and 4%. The next whatever set of columns to the right tells you what the probability of growing up to be poor is if you've ever spent part of your childhood in poverty, and you can see that that's about 4 times higher than if you've never spent any part of your childhood in poverty. And then if you look at the set of columns all the way to the right, you can see that for children who spend half or more of their childhood in poverty, the rates are about 10 times the probability of growing up to be poor if you've never been poor. So that is my starting point. I will say that researchers like me have spent a lot of time trying to understand the very complex processes that lead to the persistence of poverty across generations. But I think there's emerging agreement that health differences in childhood might be part of the story. Probably everyone in the room knows that poor children are less healthy than other children, and that those health inequalities emerge very early in childhood and continue to widen as children age. Poor children enter adulthood with more chronic health conditions than non-poor children across a wide variety of measures, including conditions such as asthma, heart conditions, and mental health problems. Poor children enter adulthood having missed more days of school, and that's at least in part related to their differences in health. And health and learning are both tied to performance in the labor market. So these are suggestive, if only in a correlational sense, that differences in health during childhood might be very important to differences in economic performance later on in life. And in fact, over the last decade or so, economists have spent a lot of time trying to essentially identify the causal effects of early life health on later life economic performance. This has also been done to some extent in the biological sciences, where the focus is on later life health. Economists, however, have also been focused on looking at the long-term effects of early life health on measures of self-sufficiency, such as education and earnings, as well as looking at later life effects on health, and have definitely documented that such relationships exist and are actually quite large in magnitude. It's also important to understand, however, that research in both the biological and psychological sciences makes clear that health and psychological well-being, which we think are important inputs into economic success, are quite malleable in early life. And so this suggests that changing the early life health environment through programs like Medicaid and SNAP might be able to break the cycle of poverty. So this is what I'm going to focus on for most of the rest of my talk. But what I want to start by doing is just encouraging you to think about Medicaid and SNAP as investments. So I think typically most of the programs that we're going to be talking about, with maybe some exception to some of Liz's programs, we often think of these safety net programs or judge them by the extent to which they alleviate the sort of contemporaneous negative consequences of being poor. So we think of them on kind of humanitarian grounds, but I want to encourage you to think of these safety net programs as investments, just like a firm invests in a piece of machinery, or you as an individual invest in your child's education. You're putting resources forward in a current time period so that in the future, children might be able to grow up to be more economically self-sufficient. I'm going to be focusing on So there is an emerging research area which is looking specifically at how these safety net programs affect later economic mobility. It's a challenging research area, which I will talk about in just a second. But the sort of bottom line is that the most credible research papers that are coming out are finding consistent evidence that not only do these programs make a difference in terms of achieving economic success and escaping poverty, but they also may be effective ways at reducing public costs in the future through increasing tax payments, through reducing medical expenses that might be borne by us, and also by reducing welfare participation, okay? So I want you to have a sense about where I'm starting and being really clear about the standards that I'm applying in evaluating this body of work. There's only really in the last 5 years started to be a body of evidence in this area, and that's partly because evaluating the long-term effects of early life investments comes with a number of challenges. So the first thing you really need is a credible research design, okay? The bulk of research in any evaluation of social policy historically has been to compare recipients' outcomes to the outcomes of non-recipients, okay? That is going to provide you with misleading results because recipients are generally very different from non-recipients. Even if you control for their income levels, individuals who choose to take up a safety net program are generally going to be different from those who do not take up a safety net program. With respect to a program like Medicaid or SNAP, which is delivering health services or nutritional boosts, you can imagine that families that have less healthy children might be more incentivized to take up those programs, and so comparing those who took it up to those who did not take it up might lead you to conclude that the program has particular effects that it doesn't have. Now, of course, the gold standard is going to be running an experiment. Running experiments is very expensive. We don't have very many opportunities to do such things and then follow children up for 30 years until 30 years later, which is about the point where you might be able to look at what the long-term impacts are. So I'm going to be talking about quasi-experimental evidence where we try to use variation across time or across geographic areas to sort of emulate what we can learn from an experiment. Okay, the second thing we need is data that provides information about both childhood circumstances and adult outcomes. The Scandinavian countries have been much better at putting together administrative data that allow us to make those linkages. The United States is further behind. I'm sort of echoing some comments that have been made earlier, but it's another reason that it has taken us a while to provide information about this. And then we need time to measure the impacts of the intervention. And what's important to point out here is that the time lags that are required for measuring these long-term outcomes might mean that program parameters or the environment in which we're doing the evaluation has changed, and that's something that you need to keep into account whenever you're thinking about these programs. Okay, so quickly, I'm going to talk, I can already see I'm running out of time, so I'm going to talk about a body of evidence on the long-term effects of the Medicaid program, which is coming from 3 research designs that sort of meet this standard for creating treatment and control groups for which you can compare children. The first one is variation in Medicaid eligibility across states and over time, which came about because of the 1980s and 1990s program expansions. And just to give you a sense of how this design works, essentially different states expanded in different ways, reaching different fractions of poor children, and you're comparing the long-term outcomes across those different states. The second type is to compare children born before and after September 30th, 1983, when there was a sharp change in eligibility. So you can see from this figure here that there was a big change. The horizontal line is showing birth cohort, and right at 1983, there's a big increase in eligibility, and the idea is to compare the outcomes for kids on either side of that line. Okay. So what do we know from these types of studies? We know that childhood Medicaid is associated with later life improvements in health measured by reductions in high blood pressure, reductions in mortality, reductions in hospital admissions for chronic conditions, lower incidency of obesity and related conditions. And in some work that I've been involved in also, we see some evidence that those health benefits persist to the next generation in terms of improvements in infant health, which we calculated to have a cost savings in the first year of life alone, just for the second generation, of about 30% of the cost of the initial investment. When we move to later life self-sufficiency, there's evidence that childhood Medicaid increases test scores, which are a predictor of future economic success, higher levels of educational attainment in terms of high school and college completion, higher levels of employment, lower incidence of disability payments, higher earnings and tax payments. And just to give you a sense of magnitudes, this paper by Brown et al. Found that each additional year of Medicaid eligibility from birth to age 18 was associated with an increase in the probability of having attended college of between 4 and 7%. Cumulative increases in wages by age 28 of $656 for women, which may seem small, but this is only to age 28, and we expect the gains to grow as individuals age. Cumulative tax payments by that age of about $127 for men and about $250 for women. And the most conservative estimate in this paper suggests that by age 60, these increases in earnings are going to allow the government to recoup about 56 cents for every dollar spent. This is the most conservative estimate. Some of their under other assumptions, they could recoup all of the expenditures. Okay, I probably don't have a lot of time left. 1 minute, that's fine. I'm close. So I wanted to talk a little bit about SNAP as well, another program which is targeting improvements in health via nutrition. So this is an even harder program to study because there's even less variation in the policy across geographic areas or over time or across different groups that we can use to create these sort of pseudo treatment and control groups. One of my former graduates, Chloe East, has a very nice study in which she focused on changes in the wake of welfare reform, which reduced eligibility for adult immigrants, thereby reducing the total amount of food stamps that was available to immigrant children. And she's essentially doing a comparison of before and after that change in eligibility. Then there was a period after that where some states were filling in availability of food stamps for immigrants. And then after 2003, those immigrant families were allowed to, the immigrant parents were allowed to get food stamps again. And what she finds by doing this sort of comparison across kids over time is that parental access to SNAP during pregnancy increases offspring's birth weight and reduces the likelihood that children are in poor health. She also finds some suggestive evidence that SNAP reduces school absences, doctor visits, and hospitalizations. Now, you might say that's not economic success, but all of these things are predictive of later life improvements in health and self-sufficiency. There's one additional approach that has been used, which is going back to the inception of the food stamp program and uses variation in the timing of the adoption of that program across different counties and essentially compares children who were living in counties that got the food stamp program early to those that got it later. And that method has been adopted in a number of studies by Allman, Hoynes, and Schanzenbach, and also a working paper now by Marianne Bittler, which, and what they find is that the availability of food stamps in early childhood lowers the in pregnancy, lowers the incidence of low birth weight by about 7%, somewhere between 5 and 11%. Birth weight is a strong predictor of later self-sufficiency. Children exposed to food stamps between conception and age 5 have better adult outcomes, both in terms of health, big improvements in the reduction in later life metabolic syndrome, and increases in measures of self-sufficiency, including educational attainment. Marion's new paper suggests that there are increases, particularly in earnings for women. Okay? Since I know I must be out of time at this point, I will not go through my summary. Let me just make two other points, which I think are three other points, quick ones that are important. Okay, one is that these studies suggest that the largest effects are amongst kids when they get these programs at young ages, so that's something to keep in mind going forward. And several of these studies find that the impacts are largest when they're focused on the most disadvantaged families. The last point I want to make, since I'm skipping over the summary, is that hopefully I've convinced you that if you put the most rigorous research designs to this question, there's pretty strong evidence that early life access to these programs is having a long-term beneficial effect on producing self-sufficiency in adulthood. Obviously, we need to weigh those benefits against the costs. And one of the costs that is coming up a lot in conversation now again is that these programs may reduce parents' incentives to work. And we know that changes in family income and in parental time with children have their own effects on children. My own reading of the literature is that you're right that there are reductions in parental work as a result of these programs, but most of studies find that those effects are pretty small. So that's something to keep in mind going forward. And since I am totally out of time, I will just put up my, oops. I will put up some of my summary. Well, we can talk more about it later, but thanks.
Okay, maybe that wasn't the right thing. So I'm all fine because Dawn and Brad Hardy already made some of my points. I'm gonna talk a little bit about what I think AFDC TANF has to tell us about today. I'm going to talk about the ITC, and then I'm going to mention some stuff about UBI, which came up in one of the questions. Okay? So everybody in this room, particularly the practitioners, know we've had huge changes in the cash assistance program in the last 20 years. Sure. Around the same, so there were these large EITC expansions in the mid-90s. The child tax credit appears in the late 90s. We have a booming economy like we have now, and at the same time we change from the entitlement to the block grant, okay? The block grant has sanctions, time limits, and a lot of state flexibility, as Dawn spoke about, okay? So TANF is fixed in nominal terms, which means that it's shrunk by about a third since over the 20 years. The states had to track hourly work activities, as Dawn spoke about. You know, all the practitioners in the room are aware it takes a lot of effort to track the hours that people are going to have. It's very expensive and has additional administrative costs. There were work requirements, at least the read from Grogger, Caroli, and Clareman in a RAND review of all that we knew about welfare reform around 2003 was that there were not large impacts of the work requirements in this setting, and states had a lot of flexibility to use TANF for other stuff. And in particular, for two reasons. First of all, when there's a block grant, you don't have to use matching dollars anymore. You can use the money on stuff you want to. And secondly, you know, the states have just moved some of this money to other things because they don't have to actually count the hours that people are doing when they use the money for marriage promotion, or they use the money for the state and EITC refundable part, or they use the money for childcare. Okay, so there are two reasons why states might want to repurpose some of this money. And then finally, the fact that it's a block grant means that in many states, but not all, so as I learned last night from Dawn, Florida sort of was very quickly able to respond during the Great Recession with their TANF program because of the way it's administered there. But there are other states where, when times were bad, you couldn't respond to the Great Recession, okay? So I think those are all warnings for design of other programs. So we know now TANF is reaching a lot fewer families. This is the share, this is the number of administrative data on families getting TANF AFDC per 100 families with children in poverty. You've probably seen this figure before, but the cash part of the program has shrunk a lot, okay? States are repurposing their funds. There was a lot of effort in that big, fat law and then tons of regulations afterwards to try to constrain how states were spending their money and what they were doing, which Don has said is partially a bad thing. So here we see this is the average for everybody. So the important thing to note is the dark blue thing is cash assistance. The aqua thing is refundable tax credits. The light blue, that's pretty big, is child care. So this is everybody for fiscal year 2015, okay? So then I went and looked at a few states. So this is Arizona. You can see an enormous share of Arizona's money is spent on child welfare services, and basic cash assistance is a small share, and other things that are about work support are a small share. Arkansas, an enormous, the biggest thing is out-of-wedlock pregnancy prevention here. And then California likes to spend a lot of money on cash assistance. You can see the really big blue thing. And here we have Illinois spending a very small share on basic assistance and a lot on child care, okay? So states have a lot of flexibility, but it's very hard to believe that that's the optimal way across all states for us to be spending this money, okay? Or at least perhaps it is. I'll defer to you guys because you all know more about this than me, but that seems unlikely to me, okay? The second warning from a block grant is that the block grant is not countercyclical. This was tested in the Great Recession. This simple chart is just going to show you the change in the food stamp caseload. Percentage change is on the y-axis, and the x-axis is the change in the unemployment rate. If you put your mental line through this, you can see that there's a positive correlation. So more SNAP spending where unemployment rate went up by more, okay? This is the same graph for TANF, okay? So first thing to notice is there are some places with big positive increases in the unemployment rate and decreases in their TANF caseload in cash, which seems not the feature of a program that is countercyclical. The second thing is your mental line through this is pretty flat, okay? So when we moved away from this other program, at the same time we greatly expanded the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is a form of in-work assistance. It's not typically considered part of the safety net, but it's a de facto the biggest cash transfer that we, make to most families that are not disabled, okay? So what do we know about the EITC and work, earnings and income? We have lots of evidence that the EITC induces single mothers to work. Maybe it reduces hours for some other people. Hillary Hoynes has a paper with Ankur Patel suggesting that the EITC provides a lot of transfers to low-income working families, but the EITC is also not particularly countercyclical for low-skilled workers, okay? What happens when the way the EITC is structured is when times are bad, you lose your job. If you lose your job at the right time, you also lose your EITC grant, so it might make things worse in terms of your family income, okay? And then finally, we have some evidence about the Eitc and Kids. The Eitc improves test scores. It improves educational attainment for children and health at birth, okay? But it's important to know about all of this, that here income is tangled together with labor supply, okay? The same people who are getting these extra transfers are also being induced to work, okay? And there's no good way to separate that except for the papers that look at income at birth, okay? So one thing to also remember is some families are let out of the ITC. You have to work. It's a conditional cash transfer. If you don't work, you don't get it. So this is a graph of the distribution of families with children. You can't see the numbers very well, but it ranges from 0, which is no earnings, or no earned income, no private income, all the way up to 6 times the poverty limit. This is the distribution of families with income. The group at the bottom where there's a lot of people with zeros, they can't get the ITC. Okay, this is from SOI tax data. And then finally, just to give you a sense of the way that the distribution of the benefits of the ITC were distributed, this is the ratio of private income to poverty from the CPS. The dashed blue line is telling you the distribution of the ITC plus the child tax credit plus exemptions for families. So what you can see here is people near the poverty level, they're getting a lot of money from these components of the tax system, but people at the bottom are being missed by this, okay? So that's important to also remember when you think about the distributional effects of this in-cash in-work benefit, okay? Then finally, I just wanted to mention universal basic income because there's been a lot of policy attention to this. Hillary Hoynes and Jesse Rothstein have a great new paper that's a summary of what we know, what they think you should expect from a true universal basic income, which would be a large unconditional cash transfer. They first make the point that it would be hugely expensive. So if it were $12,000 per adult, that's $3 trillion a year. You know, we don't have that kind of money sitting around. The second point they wanted to make is based on what we would expect, we don't expect the income effect of this to lead to a very large decline in working, okay? If you phased it out, it would lead to more of a decline. And then we know a little bit from some other settings. So first of all, I think at least the way that Hillary and Diane and Doug interpret their work on these long-run effects of the food stamp program, they think you should think of food stamps as being like cash. And so that could suggest long-run positive effects of a program like this. And this is just repeating the evidence that Marianne already mentioned. And then we have some medium-term evidence about universal basic income and labor supply. First, from the Alaska Permanent Fund, where amounts of $1,000 or $2,000 get given to families in Alaska and doesn't have very much of an impact on labor supply. And then from payments to the Eastern Band of Cherokee in a bunch of papers by Randy Akey and others, they also find positive effects of getting these income transfers without big negative effects on labor supply, okay? So I don't have a slide for this, but I'm just going to say some of what I think policy lessons are. You know, if we were going to reformulate the TANF program, maybe allocation should have something to do with the current needs of states and not be based on stuff from 1995 AFDC caseloads. I think it might be nice to constrain some of what states spend in some broad categories without putting too many constrictions on them. It'd be nice to know more about what states are spending the money on, because we know a lot about what they're doing for the cash assistance part and very little about the rest. And then finally, I think making a program, economic times are great right now, but it seems likely that we're going to face a recession again, and having a program that can respond when times are bad might be useful. And then the other thing I would say is a plea for more data, more merging of data, more access for researchers so that we can learn more about these programs. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we're going to switch gears here from cash assistance to thinking about center-based programs for young children, what I'm going to refer to as early childhood education and care, or ECEC. So as you probably know, as I'm sure you know, the ECEC landscape is one with funding at all levels of government, federal, state, and local. My focus over the next 15 minutes or so is going to be Head Start, which, as we know, is the cornerstone of early childhood programming at the federal level, providing comprehensive services beyond kind of a sort of the classroom or center-based experience to nutrition, health, and parenting practices. Now, this is not to say that what's happening at the state and local level is unimportant. In fact, most of the policy action has been at the state and local level here in the form of pre-kindergarten programs, and I am going to come back around to that in this presentation. It's also not to say that other federal programming in this space is unimportant. So I'm hoping in the discussion we can talk about the Child Care and Development Fund as well as tax policy with regard to child care costs, where I think actually targeting could be changed to make those programs more effective for families right now. So rather, my choice to focus on Head Start is because the research base here is actually pretty mature and comprehensive, involves a lot of different research designs, a lot of different research strategies, Head Start in many different time periods, many different eras, and lots of outcomes as well. And in fact, I think there's a lot that we can learn by comparing studies, not just by looking at individual studies. Kind of the sum of the whole is more than the sum of the parts. So to get this conversation started, I was thinking at this point in the afternoon, just to reinforce these ideas about research design and causation, I'll start with some clip art. Okay, so you know, what informs or what makes for a rigorous research base when it comes to program evaluation. I really like anecdotes and storytelling when it comes to kind of learning about the economic landscape, but it's sort of not a way to sort of form a research policy, a rigorous policy agenda. You can get any story that you want. Now, comparing children who attend to children who don't attend, so that's a step in the right direction. We're using data, we're comparing averages, but the problem is, of course, that when you compare kids who go to a program like Head Start to kids who don't, there are going to be many differences. And in fact, those Head Start children are going to be more disadvantaged. It might actually look like Head Start's making kids worse off. Okay, so that's a problem. We don't like that. Okay, we do like experiments. So this has come up throughout the day. What do we get out of the so-called gold standard? We get to compare children who look otherwise similar, but who differ in whether they receive an intervention or not. Those children look exactly the same in the clip art, but of course what we're looking for is large samples where they're on average identical. So there have been some pretty famous experiments in early childhood education and care. The first that might come to mind are these model interventions from the 60s and 70s, the Perry Preschool Project, the Carolina Abecedarian Program. Those studies have found, or the studies of those programs have found, really large long-term effects on average, despite there being kind of fade out in test score impacts. Now, the issue with that and kind of extrapolating today is those programs took place in a very different kind of economic and social environment. They weren't programs operating at scale, and the samples are actually quite small. But along comes the Head Start Impact Study in the early 2000s, where we are looking at programs at scale. We have much more data, and sort of the finding that you know might be familiar with for all of you is that there's an impact on test scores, but it fades out really rapidly. And of course, some reactions to that kind of weren't necessarily positive. So here, just to throw up a few headlines here about this. Here's a quote from the Wall Street Journal. I will say I believe that the article that this quote was in has been taken down from the Wall Street Journal's website. At least the links I was looking at no longer work. So this is from a Media Matters website. Head Start is well-intentioned, and that's enough to keep throwing money at it despite the outcomes. But misleading low-income parents about the efficacy of the program is cruel and wastes taxpayer dollars. So where we are right now, because I think the Head Start Impact Study is so important, is we need to think about, is this the right takeaway from those findings or not? And I have 3 takeaways for you, actually, for the rest of the presentation, just sort of to set them down for you right now. First, the alternative to participation actually matters quite a bit here. So if children are drawn from other early childhood programs, you're less likely to see an impact, okay? And this is something that we can see within the Head Start Impact Study, as well as by comparing across studies, and I'm going to speak to that. Secondly, Head Start is actually the alternative to state and local pre-kindergarten, and we just don't know enough about what that means yet. Are these programs collaborating with each other? Are they competing with each other? We need to know more there. And finally, we need to understand why programs work or don't work to develop or design good policy. I feel like I'm echoing a lot of the points that Carolyn was bringing up in the first panel about, you know, at some level we're no longer asking the right question when we're just asking about what's the effect of participation. We need to know why participation works sometimes and not others. Okay, some more visuals here. Okay, on the importance of the counterfactual. So this is from some work that I did with Diane Schanzenbach a few years ago. I've got 2 axes here. The horizontal axis we have child's socioeconomic status, and on the vertical axis we have something about the quality of their learning and growing environment, their EC environment. So in the absence of any kind of program, okay, it's not necessarily a line here, okay, but we expect an upward sloping relationship here, that the children who are in higher socioeconomic status households, is that would translate into some pretty nice or positive long-term outcomes. So there has been, in fact, where a lot of the research on Head Start's been happening has actually been on studying Head Start at its inception, okay, back in the 1960s and 70s. So this is a map from a forthcoming study by Owen Thompson at Williams, which is showing that there was pretty dramatic variation over the late 1960s in when these programs were established at the county level. And so what this means from a researcher's perspective, and this is very similar to kind of the food stamp research here as well, from a research perspective, it means, there are kids who are kind of similar to each other, who live not that far apart from each other, who had different access to these programs, okay? And if we roll the time period back a little bit, you know, kids who are a little bit older in those same counties would have had similar access, which would be no access at all. So if you put those 2 things together, kind of a nice difference in differences type of approach, where I can compare kids over time in counties as they adopt and kind of use counties which didn't adopt at the same time as a comparison group. So one step beyond an experiment to get sort of an additional comparison group for differences across cohorts. So the studies that have been using this, they're represented with the DD on this slide. They've been finding some really nice outcomes over the longer term. Reductions in crime, there's a new paper using administrative data from North Carolina showing that. Increases in education earnings and self-sufficiency. A series of papers using different data sources, but a similar research design. 3 different data sources here, NLSY, PSID, and restricted use census and ACS data. Perhaps maybe the most intriguing study here is the last one that I mentioned, that in the next generation, so the children of women who would have experienced these programs or not as children, okay, they appear better off as well. Okay, so there is sort of potential here to break that cycle of poverty. There are other research designs as well that have been used here. The one, just in the interest of time, that I'm gonna focus on is the siblings comparison. Okay, so comparing siblings who went to Head Start to those who didn't. That approach has really dominated the conversation or the sort of research base about Head Start in a slightly later era. So in the 80s in particular. I say 80s and 90s here, but this research is mainly from the 80s. There's been a regression discontinuity approach here as well to compare kids whose families are near the income thresholds for eligibility. Anyway, the bottom line here is from this research that you also see over the longer term positive impacts, and it's for these cohorts that we also see that fade out. So just like in the Perry Preschool Project, Carolina Abecedarian, fade out, reemergence of these longer term impacts, okay? Right, but what did the landscape look like, okay, when these studies were carried out? So this is a graph from a paper of mine that's showing trends in the fraction of all 4-year-olds, that's the dark blue line at the top, and all 3-year-olds, that's the lighter blue line, enrolled in public preschool. Okay, so Dave Deming's study on the 1980s was really looking at those cohorts that I just highlighted, okay? The Head Start Impact Study is up here. Okay, so what that means is that during the period when the Head Start Impact Study was carried out, the likelihood of you finding yourself in some other center-based program was much higher, okay? So that means, back to my picture, that the alternative is now different. It's not necessarily that you're home with mom or with grandma. It's that you're in some other type of program, which if it's shoring up the learning environment, we're not going to expect to see much of an impact, okay? So what we're getting out of that is an average effect across 2 different kind of types. On the other hand, there are a couple of studies using different methods that have kind of imposed a little bit more structure on the data that show that there are larger short-term test score effects for kids who would otherwise be at home or in informal care, whereas the effects for kids who would be in some other center are actually close to 0. Okay, so that's sort of that hypothesis that I had about the counterfactual kind of appears to be playing out in those papers. So the Klein and Walters paper is challenging but very rewarding, and I wanted to highlight a couple of other key results from that paper for you. First of all, the estimates from the Head Start Impact Study are actually too noisy, okay, to conclude with confidence that there is complete fade out. So we like to talk about point estimates, but there's a lot of uncertainty around them in research, and they really remind us of that when they point out that kids who went low-cost ways of improving outreach of the program, that might actually be an effective way to increase the benefit-cost ratio of the program. Another interesting point they make is the existence of substitutes that are actually publicly funded reduce the net cost to government of these programs, which raises the benefit-cost ratio of the programs as well. And finally, you might say, well, how are you monetizing benefits? And so to demystify this process, when we don't have long-run outcomes yet, what their expansion of these programs, we don't actually understand this very well. It's something I've emphasized in my own research. I don't really have a dog in the fight on Head Start. I guess I do when it comes to state and local programs, but I've really kind of tried to understand it's really about state and local versus Head Start then. Okay, how different is the quality of those 2 programs? And the interaction, the interactions between these two types of programs are understudied. So I brought up that collaboration or competition language. That's actually borrowing from Daphne Basak, who has a 2012 paper showing that as pre-K programs for 4-year-olds have expanded, Head Start programs for 3-year-olds have grown. Okay, so there's been kind of a downward push in the age distribution of Head Start centers. An additional question here is what happens to the private sector as this happens, because preschool programs cross-subsidize infant and toddler programs, which are more expensive to provide. Okay, and finally, why do we have any benefits? So I think the question really is now, okay, we have a lot of evidence on the effective participation. We need to understand, moving from the extensive participation margin to the intensive margin or quality, what makes a program more effective. So the knowledge base here is basically non-experimental. I want to talk about 2 studies, both of which try to use variation across sites, basically, to learn about the elements of programs which work or don't work. So in terms of Head Start, probably the best paper here is by Chris Walters, which finds, first of all, that there's a tremendous, within the Head Start impact study, there are multiple sites. You can treat each of them as an individual experiment. There's dramatic heterogeneity across programs that swamps the average effect, actually, okay? So that's one thing. Much of that variation is unexplained by the things that we observe about these centers. And the things that matter might be things you might expect, like full day programs appear to be more effective, having home visitation appears to be more effective, having more kids who would otherwise be at home is more effective. I don't have that on the slide, okay? But there aren't really gains from higher teacher education, the high scope curriculum, or class size, okay? So those are things that we might have expected, or where policy, I should say, is kind of ahead of research. Here. And in terms of state variation in pre-K, it's kind of like what Marianne was talking about with like what happens at the local level with TANF. It's hard to imagine that this variation in the quality of pre-K programs, the resources devoted to them, and the fraction of kids who go, it's hard to believe that that's optimal. It's almost as if people are blindfolded and kind of throwing darts at a board and decide. Whereas a universal program might substitute for Head Start, but do something different, okay? In my bio, I mentioned something about political voice. It might be something about political economy, about having higher income families involved in some way in those programs. And it seems to be a larger effect where schools are less segregated, okay? So I'm going to leave it there.
That all the programs that they've talked about are investments in families. And one of the first things I think about when we say investment is, well, what is the return on that investment? You know, what are the employment, the earnings, taxes paid, the use of safety net benefits for these children as adults. And in order to know anything about that, we have to have a long-run view of these programs to learn anything about kind of the intergenerational economic mobility. So I just want to ask the panelists if you could talk a little bit about having kind of that long-run view and how important it is to think about the fact that we may not get results for 20, 30, 40 years on some of the benefits of these programs.
I can go first. So I think, first again, more data. The more data you give to us, the more we can look at. But separately from that, I think one thing is, you know, it's certainly true that if you don't see any short-run effects of these programs on outcomes that they're meant to affect, it doesn't seem as important to worry about long-run ones. And I'm looking at Jeff, maybe he's my guru for program evaluation, but there aren't a lot of programs where nothing happened when you first did it and then later on you saw something. So those are ones where you could safely perhaps abandon ship.
Original program looked like, the evidence suggests that may not be a very good idea. So yes, you have to be patient, and for sure, you know, a lot of what we're learning about these programs in a very general way is not coming from the United States, it's coming from other countries. The programs we talked about are programs that are specific to the United States, but there is more knowledge out there which backs up what we're finding by using data from other countries because they have been more progressive about investing, I'll use that word again, investing in putting these data sets together so that you can follow folks over time. But yeah, just to repeat what I said even if we don't know how a change in policy that adds a new dimension is going to play out for 30 years, what we do know from looking at things like the rollout of programs in the 1960s is that the programs as they looked compared to having no program at all were certainly very effective, and I think that's important to keep in mind in their current environment.
And this is a perennial issue, of course, in early childhood. Today, maybe it'll be the case that those Head Start Impact Study cohorts, we don't see any long-term impacts. I don't know, though. I kind of doubt it just based on the patterns that have been established. But the more we understand about why, the easier it's going to be to sort of to allay concerns about waiting 20, 30, 40 years.
I think we'd like to open it up for questions. I think there's one right here.
I'm an enthusiastic member of the fan clubs of everybody on the panel, but I want to cheat them a little bit, or push them a little bit, because the title of the panel is how do we target safety net programs, and I don't think we heard anything about targeting hardly at all. And so I would like to see if they would like to address the nominal subject of the panel and discuss targeting.
I was pushed into talking about Head Start. No, so I have actually, so as I mentioned, the federal kind of policy landscape in early childhood also includes CCDF kind of child care subsidies, as well as tax policy. So tax incentives well, Marianne, I think was it you who were telling me sort of the exact numbers? I don't know, but like what fraction of families who are eligible for these subsidies don't get them? Quite a few. You could reach more families with the need at a younger age if the targeting were improved. Same goes for tax policy. Same policy, ages 12 and under. Okay? Even though, like I said, schools are doing a lot of heavy lifting when it comes to providing child care, even though that's not the purpose of it. In addition, tax policy is very, very regressive. Okay? The largest benefits go to the highest income families, and they're more likely to get benefits from them. Okay? By creating sort of a child care tax credit that's non-refundable, you could go some way, which there are lots of challenges involved in that. We could go some distance toward targeting those resources toward the families. I mean, I love my, my flexible spending account where I get tax savings through pre-tax dollars. I'm sure many of you do as well. But is that really going to change my behavior, whether I work? What kind of child care I send my child to? No. Okay. But for those other families, it very well might. So there you go. That's what I have to say about targeting.
So I did have a slide up there a little bit about the kind of targeting I think you're thinking about, but I was running out of time, so I just kind of lost it. Having read and participated in the research that's being done on both the income effects program, income interventions, and SNAP and Medicaid, I think if you look at the studies as a whole, those that look at, there's not a lot that have looked at differences by age, because that's sort of like the next step, since this is an emerging literature, but there does seem to be some evidence that early childhood the benefits are larger in early childhood than in later childhood. That is not to say that if we don't put all of our money into early, that's not to say that there's no hope in terms of providing money at later ages, and I wouldn't want anyone to go away thinking that. The prenatal period seems to be particularly important for Medicaid and for SNAP. The other thing that seems to be coming out of this literature is that the most disadvantaged groups are the ones that are benefiting the most.
And I'm going to push back because the ITC is targeted to people that have earnings. So I showed the graph about the large.
Yeah, so in your talk, one of the outcome of investing, in those, safety program is, higher income. Then when I look at your research design, you use, different states. So how do you actually, operationalize, higher income based on the different dynamics, that's around, this study.
I'm not quite sure I understand what you mean. So I talked about several different research designs. Most folks, I think, don't think of Medicaid as an income boost, although you certainly could, because it's providing health insurance that you would otherwise have to pay for yourself. With SNAP, as Marian talked about before, there's a way of thinking about SNAP as essentially just a boost to income. So there, what you would do is you would think of the additional income that is going into the family as the additional amount of food vouchers that they're getting through the SNAP program. And the main way in which folks have looked at the effects on children is to compare places where they're getting that additional income essentially versus places where they're not. But I'm not sure
I'm not, very clear, about, what you mean by higher income, because, income, if you live in a small state like, Iowa, for instance, you can compare them, with California. So when you talk about, those programs, actually achieve, higher income, how do you actually find a standard way, to measure that? That's my question.
So is your question kind of about these states are different?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So often it's not exactly like an experiment, but it can get close with the right additional kind of control variables in intervention. Sometimes you get lucky, and actually it really does look like, and I showed you the Head Start rollout kind of map too, and it's similar to the food stamp one, although different variation. That you get counties that are very close to each other geographically, so you can just look within states across counties, and that helps with some of this. It's not just sort of across states. Within states that have different policies, if they're kind of applied in similar ways at the county level, you can get rid of that kind of source of bias, right? And sometimes it really does kind of look like a coin flip almost within a state. Which is nice. So we're not really so much focusing, that literature, if I know, I think it's mainly using county level variation, not state level variation. And the way that the estimation is carried out doesn't use the state level component of it. Okay, looks within. Yeah.
This is, I guess, mostly aimed at Elizabeth, but I'm really interested to hear what anyone else's input as well. So you talk about the fade-out effects, and we see MTO, no immediate academic achievement effect. 20 years later, the kids are in college. We see the same thing in STAR. We see the same thing with Head Start, with Terry, Hepstarian, et cetera. So we talked about we have to wait 20 to 30 years to know whether they work or not. I'm wondering, are we just...
The reason why we use a test score is it's just sort of like it's there. we can measure it. There are measures of and exactly what do we mean by non-cognitive? Self-esteem, motivation, locus of control, all these things. I mean, I think that the upshot from the work that Heckman has done is that all of that kind of stuff, to the extent that we can measure it, actually is kind of important to these long-term effects. So that there is something possibly that we're not measuring. I also have some work with Doug Steger, trying to understand whether fade-out is just like a statistical artifact that comes from, we standardize tests, we kind of tend to re-express test scores in distributional terms, like how much does this move you in the distribution. But if distributions are getting wider over time, you're going to, that sort of gained knowledge that you get initially kind of gets swamped by that variation in the distribution, and it starts to look smaller even though it doesn't necessarily go away. And we find some evidence that might account for like 30% of fade out is just like measurement issues, even in that measure. So, but there's still a lot of stuff we don't know.
Can I add one other piece to that? In addition to changes in things like executive functioning, as you probably know, the Head Start has a health component, right? So it may also be that it's physical health that is changing, which then makes you more productive later on. So.
Hi, I work in ACF in the Office of Child Care, and am aware of the research that we've been spending millions of dollars on, both in the Office of Child Care for CCDF and Head Start, and how each year we see these measures evolve, and we see people who've spent their lives working on it, like you all, talking about how those measures are changing and how they're finding out things they didn't know before, and how the pieces interrelate to each other in ways that looking at them in silos, which makes it easier to evaluate, doesn't really tell us the whole story. So, and we're getting more and more nuance as time goes on in how we look at these things. And I'm just a little bit worried that some of the conclusions that you may be drawing sort of make things seem like a little more of a done deal than they are. And I thought maybe you could address some of this emerging measures and how you look across these pieces like EITC and child care, and how you account for all the children that actually are in the underground child care system where we have no idea at all what's going on with them.
Can you elaborate on emerging measure? Like, can you give an example of what you mean there?
Well, just in lifetime, that's just one.
Yeah. So in the early childhood space, one of these metrics that's emerged in recent years is called class. So Bob Pianta at Virginia's been has, and it's sort of a rubric basically to try to learn about what teachers are doing in classroom and how caring and nurturing their interactions are with the children, how intellectually stimulating those interactions are. And kind of just like if you're familiar with the teacher value added literature, okay, this is getting outside of maybe like what this audience has been thinking about, but teachers that are really good at raising test scores are kind of really hard to predict on the basis of their observable characteristics. And I think you have something like that emerging with classes. It's like this measure that is independent of stuff that we typically observed about teachers, and it's pretty predictive of how well children achieve there. And I mean, I view that with excitement, thinking that this is a new piece of information that we didn't have before. But and I don't know. I hope that I didn't overstep when I was basically saying we don't know enough about why programs work exactly, and we need to know more. And measures like that, new measures are helpful, but also some new random variation in those types of measures would be helpful too. That literature is non-experimental, so.
So it was an outstanding panel, and Liz, I just wanted to, I know we've been picking on you, but I thought your discussion of the counterfactuals was really important, right? So it's not treatment controlled malpayments, and that has changed over time. And another interesting point you made in that discussion was this issue about, so as more 4K programs have come in, there have been more resources and Head Start pushed out to the younger children. I was just wondering if you could elaborate, because it seems like that could be a very positive development in the sense that we're getting started earlier with those kids, and then I didn't know if anyone has looked at, for example, whether they start at, at 3 years old, they can actually, move into a regular 4K program, maybe that gives them a different set of peers too at that level, or whether or not you see potential for, I know it's hard to grasp this when you have these different sources of funding and different programs, but just curious, since you kind of started that conversation, I just feel like a lot of potential there to learn a lot more about how to interact as well. So
I agree, and there's the one study that I mentioned on this. In general, and this isn't just about Head Start, but there's not probably been enough research on how early intervention at all levels of government is sort of affecting the private sector. So the universal programs, I think it's almost a bigger deal because as okay, 4-year-olds, we take kind of 4-year-olds, Oklahoma or Georgia, we take 4-year-olds out of like the private child care pool, and as I was saying, preschool programs help to subsidize infant and toddler care in private child care centers. So there are repercussions potentially for the private child care slots at really critical ages. And there really are, we only have kind of a few studies. Daphne Bassog at Virginia has done kind of the most work on this. In terms of what age, is it sort of better to be in Head Start at age 3 versus age 4? I think we're still trying to understand that. Or what do you do at age 3 that's different than at age 4? Because there's big developmental trajectory at those ages.
So it's just a call, I think, for more work on that topic. Yeah.
I do think some of the folks in the ed literature have gotten a little ahead on this. So I think there is some work in, I think it's Oklahoma, looking at it if you stayed in Head Start for 2 years versus you went to one of the pre-Ks. But I don't remember anything about what it found, just that was the variation.
Other questions?